some of the stuff that they're not going to be talking about in the debate tonight is about the banking system collapse that's happening over in Europe. And right now it's been confined. I guess everybody's kind of been focusing on Deutsche Bank, which we've discussed on the show. But according to the article from the Telegraph, it says much of the same diseases that affect the continental banks in Europe also affect British counterparts, including Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays, and even Lloyd's. There are essentially four factors at work here, three or four. First is it's virtually impossible to make money out of banking at zero interest rate environments. So one of the reasons that these banks are failing is because when interest rates are at zero, they can't make any money. The only way a bank makes money is they take your money, they put it into the bank, and then they immediately loan it back out. And they use your money to make money. And that's how a bank makes money. Well, when interest rates are at zero, they can't make any money. And since central banks around the world have been printing and have been dropping rates to zero and in some cases below zero, these banks are starving for capital. The second thing is that the central banks have also raised the capital reserves. So they're saying, yes, you're making less money, banks, but we don't care. We want you to keep even more money in reserve so that in case there's a disaster, you can afford to weather that disaster. But oh, by the way, that money you're keeping in reserve, we're actually going to penalize you for keeping it in reserve because we're at a negative interest rate. Does that make sense? So I have negative interest rates, makes it impossible for you to make money. Then I require you hold more capital in reserve. Those reserves, of course, held at the central bank, and the central bank is charging you a negative interest rate or basically penalizing you for having that money in savings. Sounds like it's going well, right? Third, misconduct fines, which the U.S. seems to have become just another way to further taxing the banks. So one of the ways that America is bleeding the banking system of Europe dry is it keeps imposing these penalties. So it says, "Oh, we think that you screwed up here, you screwed up there, and you owe us $14 billion." And it says the article here from the UK, it says typically banks will settle for around half of the amount initially demanded. And it now seems likely that Deutsche Bank, which now seems likely Deutsche Bank, but even so, the fines seem to be assessed almost wholly on the ability to pay rather than the extent of the misconduct itself. Now, this should come as no shock to you that the fines, they just picked a number. Oh, we think you owe 14 billion, knowing that we'll probably get 7 out of them and we know they can pay that much, so that's where we'll start our negotiation. But here's what aggravates me. I want you to think about Wells Fargo. Did you guys hear about the Wells Fargo thing where they repoed a bunch of military members' cars? They illegally went out and repoed cars that were owned by service members. And I can't remember why it was or what it was for, but it was illegal for them to do it, and they went and they did it. And so it left a lot of these military members in the lurch. And then they defrauded a bunch of people in their bank accounts by opening up accounts and charging them all kinds of money. And they're going to have to pay massive fines to the government. You want to know who's not going to get paid back? You want to know who's not going to be made whole? The guy who lost his car, the guy who was gypped because he had his account fleeced. Those guys never get paid off. The government uses these opportunities to suck money out of the banks and put it in their own pockets. I'll give you an example. When Goldman Sachs was forced to pay something like $19 billion in fines because it said that it screwed over a bunch of the people who it wrote loans for. Did the people who got screwed over get any money? No, they didn't get any money. None of the people who were supposedly defrauded made any money. They never were made whole, but the government got a big windfall of an extra $19 billion, which then gets divvied up inside the agency, gives them more money to not regulate with. This is the kind of stuff that really makes me angry. It's one of the major problems with the way justice, and I use that in quotations, gets doled out in America. You see, in a libertarian society, if Goldman Sachs was really guilty of that, if Wells Fargo was guilty of that, and we had a prosecutor bring suit, and a judgment was rendered, and it was determined that, yes, you did, in fact, defraud these people, and you do owe money, or we are going to negotiate a settlement. That money doesn't go to the government. The money goes back to the people who were defrauded. Restitution for those who were wronged. We're so focused on penalizing the company, we don't even consider the fact that the people who were actually harmed are left in the lurch. It's the same thing when you got some guy who murders someone or who commits a felony. Let's say he's guilty of theft and he steals a bunch of jewelry and he spends the money on, well, you know what, on. And I don't know. He blows the money and then he goes to jail. Well, what happens to the person who had all their jewelry stolen? Where's the restitution in that? No, instead, we're going to doubly penalize that person who lost their jewelry, who lost their belongings, because that person now has to pay taxes for the other guy to stay in jail. Why do we do this? Why isn't that guy forced to work to pay off his debt? Oh, you stole $10,000 worth of stuff from this lady. Okay, we're going to take 50% of everything that you make from now until you've got all the debt paid off. And if you choose not to work or you choose not to have a job, well, then you're going to go to prison and you can work in prison. You'll make a whole lot less in prison because we got to pay to feed you and house you and everything else, but you might make 18 cents an hour. And that 18 cents an hour that you make after all of your necessities are paid for will go to paying back the person that you owe. And only after she's been paid back for the $10,000 that you stole will you be let out of prison. Either that or you can go and find a job outside and maybe make a little bit more. It just seems really rational and reasonable, this form of punishment. To say we don't charge people for victimless crimes. If you didn't commit a crime, if we can't show harm, then we're not going to prosecute you for it. But if we do show harm, well, then we have to, there has to be some sort of restitution. It can't just be, oh, we'll punish you by going to jail. It's not, no, we're going to take $19 billion of your money and stick it into the pockets of lawmakers and bureaucrats.